Hi, I'm George Varga, pop music critic for UT San Diego, and on Live from the Fourth Floor, we talk to Dave Mustaine of Megadeth and the San Diego Symphony's associate conductor, Ken David Mazur, about their upcoming April 12th concert with the San Diego Symphony.
I've done a whole bunch of, things that are not in your regular repertoire, let's say, of symphony orchestra. But this is the first time we're doing something like this. And in general, I mean, the ideas and our conversations have been so great and inspiring. I think because we're sort of on the same frequency here in terms of talking about the music. That this is really about the music and having this mutual respect for each other's backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And bringing those together, because the first thing in our first meeting that I noticed is that Dave is such a great sensitive musician. I mean, when you think about rock musicians or pop star, sometimes you might not think, oh, very sensitive in terms of knowing a lot about the music and really looking at it from that perspective. But for this, it was perfect, and that's why our conversations have gone really well in regard to programming and putting those things together. So, but yeah, this is the first time for me to do something with a rock guitar superstar, if you will.
In my own head.
So, for a lot of us growing up, I think maybe Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple was one of the first guitarists who was incorporating classical elements into a rock framework, if you will, and then obviously Ingwie Malmsteen and a lot of people followed. So I'm curious, where did your interest in classical music begin and how, and were people like Blackmore and Malmsteen at all influential on you in terms of combining or incorporating classical and rock?
Well, I have total respect for those two players, and for me, the whole classical thing came a lot earlier than either one of those gentlemen. It came from listening to the British Invasion, which had Led Zeppelin in it, and a lot of the medieval themes of the songs are very dramatic, and they told a picture, they told a story. Or with the Beatles and George Martin doing all the string layering in the background and stuff like that, because there was a lot of magic that's in the back of those records and the ear candy. So I knew you could do this, and one of my favorite actual classically trained players that ever played in a rock band was Randy Rhoads, because it was kind of classical, not to be redundant, but instead of like somebody else's interpretation of classical, like just all over the place, like say for example a Ritchie Blackmore would do, because Ritchie's very, very talented, and I grew up listening to him. But for me, my particular the way that we were drawn to the Vivaldi stuff was because it was in a very sad kind of modality. I didn't even know. I'm self-taught, so I really don't know what I'm doing. I just do it. And so listening to the solos in there, they just had this color, this attitude to it that just really appeals to me. Like when I was listening to some of the stuff that Randy would do over Ozzy's songwriting.
What have you learned in preparing for this concert that, as a musician, you didn't know before, and until you really dug into this material, you couldn't have known?
How to play in 3/4 time very well. That's really hard. Trying to for me, you're playing in metal music. A lot of it is just repetitive motion and a lot of 4/4 time. Sometimes the time signatures will jump in tempo and stuff like that. There'll be a connecting part, but there's not really a lot of 3/4 stuff. So that's kind of interesting, especially when you're trying to find the downbeat. And if the downbeat is like in 9/8 time, and the riff actually starts on the 2 or the 3 instead of at the 1, that's really hard too. Because again, I had gone into a music class in college, and the guy started talking about the circle of fifths, or maybe it's the circle of sevenths or something like that, and I just quit because I couldn't figure it out. It was just something that was like Chinese to me.
And David, there are a lot of famous recordings of the Four Seasons. I know Simon Rattle made a pretty notable one back in the 80s, if I recall. I'm not aware of any recordings of, with the guitarist and an orchestra. So I'm wondering, as the conductor, in terms of dynamics and nuance and allowing for a soloist that is not an acoustic violin, but is in fact an electric guitar, how do you do that?
Well, I actually look forward to having our first rehearsal, with a very special instrument that maybe you'll talk about more. To actually hear it, and to respond to it, because of course the musicians, they're looking forward to this, and also they always look forward to reacting in the moment when it comes to balancing things. I mean, they know this stuff pretty well, even though we don't do Baroque music with, from that period with this size of symphony orchestra that often, but they will know it, and so this is something that's going to be interesting, because of course, like you mentioned, there's many recordings out there, and what we notice is they're all different, completely different, and they take their own personal approach to it, which is, you have to basically paint this picture, or the seasons, and then Dave will have some recordings he will have listened to, but ultimately he'll make his own in the moment and try to paint that. I mean, the reason why this has been around and it's been so popular, and you probably heard it everywhere, is because it's one of the first pieces of music that is specifically descriptive. So it's not absolute music which has no description to it, but it's supposed to be a season. So you have either summer, you have winter, spring, and you have the snowflakes, you can kind of see them, and there's different ways of interpreting that and making it your own. So I think we're going to explore that in our own way. Yeah.
Now, Dave, was there a particular recording of the Vivaldi Four Seasons or a particular violinist that you were drawn to?
Actually, there was. Good question. In the beginning, Tommy Phillips, the guy I was talking about earlier, he'd sent over a couple links to me of some recordings. One was just a standard orchestra thing, and another one was by this bloke. I'm not even gonna say his name because I don't want to embarrass him, but he said it's this guy doing a really bad version of this. And so I watched it, and the very first time I watched it, I was like, I can see where he would say that was kind of bad, but I didn't really realize how difficult the piece was. I thought, well, he did pretty good, and then I actually learned it, and I was like, wow, this is so much more involved than that. So yeah, I tend to stick to the version that Itzhak Perlman's doing, and I wish I could have found like a slow motion version of it, but that's the challenge that I've taken on, and I love challenges.